So this morning, I'm speaking on the habit of giving and tithing, which is a long-winded way of saying generosity. And there's a stereotype around the church that the church is only after your money. And if you've been around church like me for a long time, you've almost certainly heard your fair share of cringe-inducing sermons about giving. Usually these fall into two categories. There's this fellow whose Bible only ever opens to Malachi chapter 3, and he stands and stares you down daring you to let the offering bucket pass you by, so that he can remind you of the curse that you're under, while he takes the rest of the congregation on a guilt trip with shrill cries of, "Will a man rob God?" And then there's this fellow, the used car salesman with a slick smile and easy promises about give and it will be given to you, pressed down, shaken together and running over, and all the motivation that you need to give him, the church. That little bit extra is so that God can bless you that much more. I even heard one ambitious preacher suggest that by not tithing, we were robbing God of the opportunity to bless us. Combine both. But neither of these two things are good reasons to be generous. And that's why I'm here today giving this message. Too often in church, we use guilt and manipulation in the first example, or the greed that goes with the second example, as an undertone as to why we should be generous. But generosity is all about the posture of your heart. It's giving with no thought of getting something back. Generosity should be our natural response to what God has done for us. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at two examples from the Bible of two men who were generous. And we're going to learn some things about them and about who God is and how he would like us to behave when it comes to giving and generosity. So let's get started. The first one I want to talk about is Cornelius. And when I asked my wife to read through this, she says, "I've never even heard of Cornelius." Let's hear about Cornelius. So Acts chapter 10, verse 1. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, "Cornelius." Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" he asked. The angel answered him, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa and bring back a man named Simon who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel who had spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants, told them everything that had happened, and sent them to Joppa. Let's pause there. So what do we know about Cornelius from this passage? Number one, he lives in Caesarea. Who cares? But it is actually interesting because Caesarea was a maritime city in the northern half of modern-day Israel. It was renamed Caesarea in about 30 BC by the Jewish king Herod the Great. And he wanted to curry some favour with Caesar Augustus, who was the emperor at the time. So, "Look, Caesar, look how good we are. I've renamed this city after you." But the city was almost 400 years old already by that time. A few years after he renamed it, Herod began a massive construction project to build the largest artificial harbour at the time in the world, and enclosing approximately 100,000 square metres of water. So Caesarea at the time was an important, impressive, wealthy city. Cornelius was also a centurion in the Italian regiment. That means he was an officer in the Roman army, in command of around 100 men, which makes sense. Centurion, century, 100. However, he was also part of the Italian regiment, which tells us that he was not part of the regular Roman legion. He was an auxiliary, a sort of elite reservist, recruited from modern-day Italy, which means he was a Roman citizen by birth. And he was only called upon as needed to assist the standing army when his special skills were required. So we know that he had a lot of skill and experience in warfare, but was not required to fight all the time, only when the legion needed his special skills. Also, as a centurion, he would have been quite wealthy. Some scholars estimate that even though he was a mid-level officer, a centurion could have been receiving up to 16 times the pay every month from the regular soldiers under his command. So with that, combined with where he was stationed in Caesarea, this modern, thriving, rich city, life could have been pretty good for Cornelius. He could have very easily laid back, lived a good life, been waited on hand and foot, and enjoyed himself. And I'm sure a lot of his contemporaries did exactly that. But Cornelius was devout and God-fearing, which is unusual because he wasn't Jewish. Cornelius was a Roman officer. And at some point, he heard about this God of the Jews and decided to follow him. We don't know why, but we'll see in a moment that he was following blindly. He didn't know the rules. He didn't really know how to worship this God of the Jews. In fact, he wasn't allowed, as a non-Jewish person, to go into the synagogue and learn how. He did the best he could with what he knew. And the best he could was to give generously to everyone in need. He was so generous, in fact, that God sent an angel to him to thank him for his offerings. Think about it. Here's a guy, not a Jew, not allowed in the synagogue, a citizen and officer of the occupying Roman Empire. But somehow he meets God, and it so impacts him that he starts to become exceedingly generous. So much so that this God, who he knows almost nothing about, but still serves, sends an angel to him to say thank you. I love the phrase that the angel uses, memorial offering. It's that image of the cartoon pie on the windowsill that sends out the tendrils of aroma and picks up the character and draws them in. It's that time where you're walking around your streets local to you and someone's cooking something just so delicious. And you just go, oh, what is that? I want to go there for dinner. That's what's happening here. That's what this memorial offering is like. It's God going, I'm going there for dinner. And God can't help himself but to knock on Cornelius' door and ask to stay for dinner. For the sake of time, I'm going to summarise the rest of the chapter, but I do encourage you to go back and read it in your own time. Because we have God, at the same time that God has sent an angel to Cornelius, God is speaking to Peter and telling him to go and visit. And it takes some convincing, because the same religious rules that prevent Cornelius from going to the synagogue prevent Peter from going to his house. It's not allowed under the Jewish religion to fraternise with Gentiles like this. Not to mention, we've got the social faux pas of Peter, who's now quite well known, going and fraternising and going to the house of a Roman officer who's the occupying, oppressive army. So that takes some convincing. While God is speaking to Peter, Cornelius' servants arrive. And Peter agrees to go with them. When he arrives at Cornelius' house, we see the prime example where Cornelius might know about God, but doesn't know him very well. He doesn't have much theological training. He doesn't have a basic knowledge of God. He's never heard of Jesus. He doesn't know about being baptized. He doesn't even know he's not supposed to bow down to Peter. And yet God was so moved by Cornelius' generosity that he arranged an angel to visit, a dream and a vision for Peter, and then to top it off, Cornelius and his family are the first non-Jewish people to receive the Holy Spirit. And that sounds like a pretty big deal to me. And the thing I really want you to take away from the story is, if you want to move God's heart, if you want to capture his attention, start with being generous. Not with some ulterior motive of gaining God's favour. His favour is not the goal, it's a byproduct. Generosity is and has to be the goal of itself. But in doing it, God will see your heart and motivation and respond in ways that you're probably not expecting. So the next man I want to look at is Zacchaeus. We learn about Zacchaeus in Luke 19, verse 1 to 10. It says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus told him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. So what do we know about Zacchaeus? Well, Zacchaeus was a tax collector. In fact, he was the chief tax collector in Jericho. This meant he was very important, very rich, and very disliked. In ancient Rome, the way the tax collector job would work is you would go before the emperor or his representative, and you would bid to be the tax collector. You would offer to pay right here and now in advance however much you thought you could get from your region in taxes. And then once your bid was accepted, you would hand over the money, and then you spend the next year trying to recoup your costs from your friends and neighbours and businesses in your area, usually with a tidy profit attached. So you can understand why the people didn't particularly like the man who was selling them out to Caesar. I missed a slide. Not well liked. There you go. I've always read the story and thought, well, it's a great story for Zacchaeus. He met Jesus and his life was changed, which is true. But that's not what he set out to do. He wasn't trying to meet Jesus. He was just curious. He heard about this new rabbi from Nazareth and wanted to know what that would look like. Because he's heard about Nazareth, and they've got a reputation, those Nazarites. And what does a rabbi from Nazareth look like? So he wanted to get a better look, but he couldn't see over the crowd. I know how he feels. So he went ahead of the crowd and climbed a tree to get a better view. But then Jesus stops right under his tree and looks up. I just want to sit on that for a moment, because I read it and I wonder, how did Jesus address him? Was he kind of perplexed and confused, like sort of, Zacchaeus? What are you doing up there? Or was it more of that sort of tired parent vibe, like, Zacchaeus, come down from there. I've told you 100 times not to play in the tree. I think Jesus would have been more amused. Sort of Zacchaeus, what are you doing up there, mate? We're supposed to have lunch and there's not enough room for me to climb up there. So they come down, Zacchaeus comes down and they have lunch together. And we don't know what was discussed. But we do know that it moved Zacchaeus so profoundly that he was ready to give away half of all he had to the poor, and to repay 4 times as much as he had stolen from people. This wasn't required. Jesus didn't ask him to do that. He just responded to the love that he saw in Jesus. And in response to this act of generosity, Jesus excitedly declares, "Today salvation has come to this house." And it's an interesting contrast with the story of Cornelius that we looked at before, because Zacchaeus was not a generous man. He was not particularly devout. There's not even any indication he was looking for an encounter with God. He was simply curious about Jesus and wanted a better look. We don't know what was said between Jesus and Zacchaeus over lunch. We don't even know how much time passed between Zacchaeus climbing down from his tree and his life totally changing. What we do know is that Zacchaeus had a radical encounter with Jesus. He had lunch with love incarnate, and it shifted his whole world. What we see with Zacchaeus is that when we encounter God in a real and intimate way, our most natural response is one of generosity. Zacchaeus was so filled with joy and love that he couldn't help himself but want to give something away. But he didn't know how to give away the joy and love that he's just received, so the best idea he could come up with is, I'll give away all my money. That made me happy. We see from these stories two sides of the same coin. We have our response to God's ridiculous love for us, which should be an untamable desire to give it away. And then God's response to our generosity is to pour out more of his love. And then that causes us to want to be more generous. And then God responds to that generosity by pouring out more love. And around we go. I asked the worship team to sing When I Survey the Wondrous Cross this morning because of that final verse. Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were an offering far too small. Because love so amazing and so divine demands my soul, my life, my all. Like it did for Zacchaeus, when we're truly filled by the love of God, we have to give it away or it feels like we'll burst. But we don't know how to give away that love so much, so we simply give whatever we have. I'd like to leave you with a few questions this morning. Just some things to ponder and pray over this week. The first is, are you generous? And I'm not just talking about finances here. If you're here today and you're not sure how you're going to pay for groceries this week, I don't want to add to your burden. Also, if finances is a stumbling block for you, if it's something that you're not ready to deal with yet, that's okay. That's fine. Put it on a shelf and let God deal with it when he wants to. What I would ask is that you come before God in your own time this week with an open heart and open hands and say, God, how can I be generous? And let God speak to you. It might be that he wants you to be generous with your money. It might not. It might be that he wants you to be generous with your time or with your hospitality or your kindness to strangers or your forgiveness. Just ask God where he wants you to be generous this week. The next question I want to leave you with is, do you need to come down from your tree? This morning I believe there's some people here and God has called your name and Jesus wants to have lunch with you. And if you're feeling that tug on your heart, all you need to do is come down from your tree and have lunch with Jesus and just see what he says to you. The final question I want to ask you is, do you need to go and visit Cornelius? I believe there's some people here and God has been speaking to you about your need to go and visit with somebody or go somewhere particular, and your response has been, no, I can't go there. There's rules and there's expectations on me, and I can't be seen in that place. It's not appropriate, it's not... But God is telling you it's okay to go. God had to tell Peter 3 different times that it was all right to go to Cornelius' house before he was ready to do it. But when he did go, Peter was the instrument that God used to completely transform Cornelius' life. And so I would encourage you to be bold, to step out and let God use you, make an incredible impact on somebody's life.